Dr. Puschner and Dr. Poppenga are from the California Animal Health and Food Safety Laboratory. These people are doing stuff for us every day in the cattle industry and throughout animal agriculture, whether it's figuring out why our pet food was tainted with what in China, or doing routine things like selenium deficiency and those kinds of things. They're here for us every day. They're going to be they're going to have a station after lunch, so you can have some questions for them at that time. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Puschner.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us here to talk about poisonous plants. We were asked to present about poisonous plants in 10 minutes. It's impossible. So we picked a few. And because when we drove in, we saw a lot of oak, so we are going to briefly talk about oak. And then we just decided to pick the primary ones that cause mortality. So we do have dead animals with plants too, John. It's not just, So we're going to talk about oleander also, and then common groundsel, which is pretty common and in the class along with fiddleneck, and we see that quite often. So I'm going to briefly review oak. I guess my first thing is about oak. I have been at the diagnostic lab for 12 years and I've seen one case. Now that doesn't mean oak is safe, but it really, I think, means that it doesn't happen very often and only under very, very special circumstances. So although you may all think, oh, oak is toxic, it really isn't a huge deal unless the animals are exclusively eating oak for a few days and nothing else, which is obviously and luckily very rare. So just a brief overview, we have quite a lot of different oaks in the country. Around here we have also a few different species. You all probably know what they look like. They have that specific shape to their leaves, those lobes. And the fruit is known as an acorn, and that's the case I have seen. These calves actually got into acorns. What's toxic in oak? Those are called tannins. You've probably heard that term with the leather industry, tanning leather. So what happens is that these tannins can be modified in the gut of animals, and they split these tannins into a compound, and these turn into acids. And these acids are extremely caustic. So first of all, what you would expect is some kind of GI upset, because these compounds directly hurt the mucous membranes in the gut. So some diarrhea, the animals usually stop eating. But these compounds can be absorbed and then actually can reach the kidney and also destroy the kidney. And so the animals may also suffer from renal disease in addition to the GI problems. What's most toxic is right around now when the leaves and flower buds are opening up. And then the ripe acorns are also toxic, and they're most toxic when they are green, and they lose a little bit of the toxicity when they mature. So here is the key. We really don't see this unless the animals eat a lot of that stuff in a period of 2-3 days, and then they may actually get pretty sick pretty quickly. The case I have had was a case actually that came to our diagnostic lab for necropsy. Dr. Anderson was the pathologist, and he opened them up, and the whole GI tract was still full of acorns. There's nothing else in these cows. So obviously that told us, well, there probably is an issue here. And what he did see then was lesions in the kidney as well. And what had happened was there was a big thunderstorm, big rainstorm, that caused all these acorns to be blown on the ground, and these calves just started eating them and nothing else. And I think I had to look into that again, but I think we lost about 20 animals out of about 30. So we lost a large amount of animals in a very short period of time. So these calves, and this is typically described in oak poisonings, happens pretty quickly. Usually you notice some diarrhea, they stop eating. Then they become pretty weak, they lie down. And that BUN is an indicator when they have renal disease. As soon as you see that, also in animals that are still alive, they usually don't recover once the kidneys are destroyed. Good thing here, we have some animals we can use for biocontrol, goats and deer. They have some proteins in their saliva that bind these tannins and make them non-toxic. They bind them up. So this is a good chance if you really have to worry about large exposures of oak or acorns on the ground, you have no way of cleaning up, but you know you have some goats around, that's one way of doing it. Horses have also been affected by it, although I have never had a case. This actually was a kidney from a horse. That was shared with me, that picture. That's what we do in pathology, we look at these lesions in the kidney. What we do in our tox lab is we can measure a specific compound in urine. This is very specific for oak poisoning. The problem is, though, we don't know what's okay and what's toxic. We haven't had enough cases to say, well, if it's above this threshold, it's probably a poisoning. Well, if it's below that, well, we know the animal ate oak or acorns, but the animal didn't really die from it or get sick from it. So it's kind of only an indicator whether this animal ate it or not, which you probably already know because you probably observed the animal getting into it in the first place. So most of the diagnostic approach to say, yes, this animal died from oak poisoning is really based on the pathology, looking at all these changes in the dead animal. Treating, not much once the animal is exposed. Activated charcoal mineral oil has been recommended. There's no proof that either of those work, so we don't know. If the animals have some diarrhea, symptomatic care, the vet probably puts the animals on fluids. There is some thought that calcium hydroxide can be added to the ration and it binds the tannins to make them unavailable so that they're not absorbed. But again, not much known about that. Best thing is keep the animals away from getting into it in the first place. And then, like I already mentioned, use goats if you have goats around. The acorn calf syndrome you probably have heard about. This goes back to, oh gosh, some papers from the John 50s, 60s. Where they have noticed an increased rate of these calves that were born that had very strange shapes when they were born. Short legs, they were often born dead, abnormal hoofs, the head was completely distorted, and they looked like dwarfs. And initially it was thought that these cows had ingested a large number of acorns during their second trimester, and although acorns play a role in this, it is clear that it was never really reproduced just with acorns. So the thought is there has to be something else, probably also very poor nutrition, that results in that acorn calf syndrome. And since I've been in the laboratory, I don't think we've had another case of that submitted. And I'm going to turn it over to you. Talk about the other stuff.
Always hate to be the last person between an audience and their lunch. So going from a poisonous plant that really the frequency of intoxication is relatively low to the number one poisonous plant that we deal with in the diagnostic lab, and that's oleander. This is a picture of oleander here. That's not a plant that occurs in Pennsylvania, where I spent about 10 years. So this is sort of a new plant for me the last 3 years. It is a ubiquitous plant. It likes the dry, warm weather of California. It's actually a non-native plant. It was introduced into this country from the Mediterranean area. One of the things that we always are concerned about with poisonous plant is differentiating the bad plants from the good plants. And one of the other plants that sometimes can be confused with oleander, and that's eucalyptus, which is also another ubiquitous plant here. So sometimes if we're diagnosing oleander intoxication by looking at rumen contents or GI contents, we have to differentiate the oleander leaf from the eucalyptus leaf. It's a equal opportunity poisonous plant. Pretty much any species can be intoxicated with oleander. We've actually been involved in several cases of human intoxication, either through criminal activity or through suicide attempts. All parts of the plant are toxic, and this is very important because the dried leaves are toxic. A lot of the cases we see involve animals ingesting the leaves, and those things can blow quite a distance from the plant or be incorporated into forage. It's a very toxic plant. You can see the minimum lethal doses. 5 leaves can kill your average sized cow. So it doesn't take more than a mouthful of the plant to cause, most of the time, acute intoxication. Clinical signs can be fairly nonspecific. I mean, they're not so characteristic that you can diagnose intoxication just on the clinical signs. Very often it does affect the GI tract with some diarrhea or some colic. But the main target organ for the toxin in oleander is the heart. And it can cause damage to the heart muscles. It can cause heart arrhythmias, and that's generally what causes the acute death of the animal. Diagnosis can be fairly straightforward if you're doing a field postmortem or the animal comes into the diagnostic lab. If we look carefully in the gastrointestinal contents, very often we will find fragments of leaves. And the anatomy of the leaf is unique enough that if you've looked at these cases over the years, you can generally pick out the oleander leaves pretty rapidly. Here again, we do differentiate those leaves from the eucalyptus leaves. So that's traditionally one way to do it. There are some post-mortem lesions that a pathologist can pick up on, primarily microscopically, heart damage. That is not unique to oleander, but it is a clue. And at least in our lab, we're probably the only veterinary diagnostic lab in the country that has developed an assay for the toxin in oleander, which is called oleandrin. And we use some very sophisticated equipment to detect it in rumen contents or urine or serum. We do have a variety of species that are intoxicated by oleandrin. The number one species, it seems to me, over the 3.5 years I've been here, are the camelids, the llamas and alpacas. Very common. Less so in cattle. Probably the next most affected species, I would say, would be horses. Would you probably say that? Mm-hmm. So cattle a little bit further down on the list. But this was a case involving some lactating cattle. They had 16 in this pen. 6 of them died within 24 hours. This was a large dairy of 600 cows. And these guys were just found dead, which is very typical with oleander. Other information, all animals were off feed a little bit. That was the initial clinical signs, so very nonspecific, not very diagnostic. All the animals in the dairy got the same ration. But in this particular case, there was some of the leaves from the oleander that got mixed up in the total mixed ration. Diagnostic workup, we did find plant parts in the GI tract. There was some damage to the heart on postmortem exam. And then we did do specific testing for the oleandrin. The nice thing about the test is we can get the results very rapidly. So if we have a case where we're concerned about maybe a large die-off, very often within several hours we can confirm the exposure to the oleander. The oleandrin is called a cardiac glycoside. There are a lot of other poisonous plants that also contain cardiac glycosides. But this is a toxin that really does damage the cells in the heart. And once that damage occurs, then there are all sorts of arrhythmias that are as a result of that. As far as treatment, probably the best thing to do is, if you recognize exposure, is to try and get some type of adsorbent in the GI tract in these animals. And most often we recommend activated charcoal. That actually binds that oleandrin in the GI tract, preventing it from being absorbed and subsequently damaging the heart. Beyond that, really, the animals are going to require probably fairly intensive treatment, probably in a veterinary hospital. There's not much that can be done in these animals out in the field. We actually have had a number of animals. I'd say the prognosis in these cases is pretty poor. Most of these animals do wind up dying. But we actually have had some animals come in our veterinary teaching hospital that have survived with fairly intensive treatment. So it's best to avoid exposure. There are some other specific treatments. There's actually an antibody that's designed for digoxin, which is a human pharmaceutical also used in veterinary medicine. That antibody will cross-react with oleander, but I think that's very cost prohibitive in terms of use. So again, the prognosis is very, very guarded. So these are some of the other plants that contain similar types of chemicals, and we've actually that cause the cardiac damage. And you do find some of these plants in California. We've actually had some horses involved in exposure to Adonis estivalis. Some are pheasant's eye, but you can see some of the milkweeds. Some of those are more ornamental plants, like the foxglove. but all these plants can cause very similar effects. And I don't know, we do have this afternoon, do you want me to just briefly talk about the... Real fast. Okay. Well, with the oleander, it's very acute intoxication. The other group of poisonous plants that we run into problems in California contain what are called pyrrolizidine alkaloids. And in contrast to the oleander, this tends to be more of a chronic problem because it does take exposure to these alkaloids over a fairly long period of time to result in clinical effects. These are plants that can be common in California, primarily in the genus Senecio, and also the fiddleneck, the Amsicchia. The pyrrolizidine alkaloids actually are several dozens of different individual compounds. Some are more toxic than others. The target organ is the liver. And as these are ingested over a period of days or weeks or even months, there is very subtle subclinical damage to the liver. The animals oftentimes don't become symptomatic until liver function is compromised. And by that time, the prognosis for those animals is pretty poor because there's so much damage to the liver. So this is just Senecio vulgaris, common ground cell that is common in California. This is the Amsicchia. We actually have some plants this afternoon that we can show you. That's just coming up now. A lot of these plants are not terribly palatable. A lot of the problems that we run into are when these are incorporated into forage or hay. Sometimes these plants have been incorporated into pellets, and if those are fed over a period of time, these animals are severely affected. Not all animals are affected equally. Horses and cattle are more susceptible to pyrrolizidine alkaloids than are sheep and goats. And you know, the dose is certainly going to have a major influence on how rapidly these animals show clinical signs, but even very low levels over a prolonged period of time can be problematic. So the clinical signs related to animals just aren't doing right because their liver function is so impaired. So there can be weight loss, neurologic signs, but very nonspecific. Most of the time this is diagnosed on postmortem exam after a pathologist has had a chance to look at the liver. And clinical signs can actually not occur until long after the last exposure to the pyrrolizidine alkaloids. So sometimes that can be a difficult thing to diagnose because there's a disconnect between exposure and the onset of clinical signs. So this is Senecio vulgaris in alfalfa hay. That's not showing up very well. One plant that, if it gets incorporated into hay, can be a little difficult to differentiate between is a sow thistle, which is not a problem, versus the common ground cell. So sometimes it takes somebody with some botanical experience to actually identify these plants in a forage sample. And this was just a case that we had about a week or so ago. A lot of times, if it's a pyrrolizidine alkaloid that especially gets incorporated into hay, or in this case this was pellets being fed to horses, it winds up involving the lawyers because there's generally some blame there that they want to place. And this was a case where actually these rough short pellets had very high concentrations of pyrrolizidine alkaloids. And you're not going to be able to really look at those pellets and identify a foreign plant in there. But those pyrrolizidine alkaloids do quite well during the processing, and that resulted in the deaths of, I think it was 3 horses. So I will leave it at that.